This is Moments of Truth, the webcast with and for customer success professionals. I'm Andrew Marks, co-founder of Success Hacker. Today, I am joined by Chris Hicken, CEO at nuffsaid, a workflow intelligence platform. Prior to nuffsaid, Chris was president and COO at user testing and on-demand human insights platform. Chris, welcome to the program, and thanks for making time for me today. Congrats on the seed funding earlier this year. I remember back when raising $8 million was a round day. So it's amazing what's happening in the funding space these days. Why don't you tell our viewers and listeners more about you and the nuffsaid platform?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And first, want to thank you for inviting me onto the show. I've been hearing about you for years, so pleasure to finally meet you in person. I'm a little bit regretting the extra spicy red curry that I ate right before this, so that might make this conversation a little bit more peppy. Let's talk just very briefly about nuffsaid. So we call ourselves a workflow intelligence platform, and the problem that we're trying to solve for the world is that people, especially knowledge workers, are increasingly overloaded with information and communication at work, and it's hard to focus on the work that matters. And we're getting bombarded constantly daily from email, chat, SMS, LinkedIn, customer updates, newsletters, notifications, etc. And so nuffsaid's goal is to solve this problem, but not in the traditional way. So most companies try to solve this problem by building a productivity app that will help you get more things done in your day. But nuffsaid's vision is a little bit different than that. We are building AI-powered brains that sit on your shoulder, and those brains understand who you are at work, what your goals are, and what department you're in. And with that understanding, not only filters out all the junk and the noise in your daily workspace, but more importantly, surfaces up the behaviors and activities that will actually move the needle for your job. So that's the very largest vision of where we're going. And of course, way too big of a vision for an early stage company to tackle. So we've decided to hone in as our first customer for this brain is going to be customer success.
Oh, interesting. Sounds fascinating. God knows I could use that.
Yes, I think we all could, and we've got a really good team pulled together to build it.
Excellent. Well, I wish you the best, and as always, anything that we can do at Success Hacker, I can do for you to help you in that journey. Please feel free to let me know. But thank you for the overview. For our time today, though, I'm really interested in digging into your perspective on customer stakeholders. You know, they're an important piece of the customer success puzzle. The buying process has changed, and new roles have emerged from those enterprise software days of old. You need to know which roles to focus on, and you need to have a strategy for engagement. Now, you published something in early September that got a lot of buzz, and it made a lot of sense to me. I really liked the way you laid out the current state and established a framework in that blog post. Can we spend our time today digging into that?
Yes, and let me just give you a little bit of context for this piece to talk about how it formulated, which was we've been doing this the series where we interview top CS leaders, and one thing that kept coming up over and over again is that top CS leaders are tired of hearing about tactical feedback on how to run customer success, because what they say is a lot of times every business is different, so tactics that might work for one business don't work for theirs. And so the genesis of this piece was actually around the framework, the thinking for how to put together a champion coverage strategy that could encompass all different types of businesses. So it's really more of like a framework. There's not much in the way of advice on how to run your champion playbook, but more how to think about it to develop a more sophisticated playbook. So that's how the piece started. And I think before we talk about the content or the meat of the piece, it's worth giving a little bit of context, which is, David or Andrew, you and I grew up at a time when we sold software, we sold to, there were VPs, there were directors, and then there was our daily point of contact. And we knew that the VPs had the budget and the directors could influence the VP, and that's how we got our deals done. And upgrades, expansion deals, we're selling them the latest version of software. So this concept of how to sell into an enterprise is very intuitive to us, but for people who didn't grow up through account management, when SaaS started to evolve and product-led growth started to become the norm in selling software into the enterprise, these new roles emerged. So you started hearing about things like champions and buyers and power users. Well, what do those things mean? And so uh, uh, the core of this piece is about helping to bring back some of the simplicity of the days of account management, bringing that to customer success, and I don't know if we're going to call it demystifying, but at least putting some definitions around what those words mean and how to think about the champion strategy. So that's the kind of tee up for the piece.
Got it.
I think I can probably go ahead and just jump right into, unless you want to ask any questions, just go ahead and jump right into the meat of it.
I love the concept. I love the and I love what you guys are doing, and I can understand why this is important, and I can see why nuffsaid is going into customer success. It's something, quite frankly, it's something that we've always felt is missing. So, it's having that methodology, ensuring that the right people are doing the right things in the right ways at the right times, is like the missing link. So I'm really excited for you guys, and I love the way that you have kind of laid out the problem and then the framework that helps address it.
Yeah, and I think we might have a unique perspective, because in order to create a powerful and effective AI-powered brain, you have to give the brain a model to work from. And so a lot of what we're doing is just sharing our thinking about how to build a model for a brain, which we'll share with you today. So the first step of creating the championship model, the relationship coverage model, is to define the roles. So what does it mean when we say buyer? What does it mean when we say champion? So Andrew, I'm going to share my screen, and for people that are listening in via the podcast, I'm just going to describe what I'm seeing here on the screen. So in the defining of the roles, what I'm showing here is a quadrant. So there's 4 boxes on my screen, and there are 2 axes. One axis is how important is the product to that person in the organization, and the other axis is how much influence or authority does that user have in a buying decision or in a process decision. So in the bottom left-hand corner, we're looking at people where the product is not very important to them and they have a low amount of influence. And that person, we're just going to call a user of the product. So they might use the product, they might even use it daily, but they don't need to use the product to get their job done, and they don't have a lot of authority when it comes to making decisions in the company. So we're just going to call that person a user. They're probably the least valuable type of user, the least valuable type of contact in the account. Then moving up from there, we're going to talk about a user who has low influence, but the product is very important for them to get their job done. And so we're going to call that user a power user. And while they don't have a lot of influence in the buying decision, they, kind of two comments that I want to make about power users. They can directly influence the champion, and we'll talk about why that's important in a moment. And if lots of power users get together, they can work together to increase their influence in a buying decision. So for example, if Slack, for example, has hundreds of power users, they can work together to try to influence the buyer to buy Slack over Microsoft Teams, for example. So those are kind of the low influence. Yeah, go ahead.
That makes sense. Although, I mean, I think in general you nail it. I definitely have been in situations where an individual power user does have a lot of influence, but that's usually influence that has been welcomed by the champion or by the buyer.
That's right, and I think that's.
I think in general, though, your assessment on that is spot on, and I love the concept of the group of power users.
Yeah, And
being
I
able
think
to
you're
wield
right.
influence.
I want to double click because I agree with you, Andrew. There are definitely cases when someone who is very senior on the team is typically someone who's been at the company for a long time in the role. They're very much trusted and respected by leaders in the company.
Yeah.
That person can sometimes wield quite a bit of influence in buying decisions. So I agree with you that, that case does sometimes come up.
Actually, back in the day, when we were doing that account management motion, even though in post sales, that user that you just described, that power user that you just described, was part of my account penetration strategy as well as my adoption strategy to find that person and use them to help
I
drive
agree, and
adoption.
I think in modern software sales or customer success, the power user is still very useful for a very similar purpose in that you can have them influence the champion to adopt the product more broadly across the team or the company. So let's go ahead and use that as a segue. So when we jump over to the champion box, we're talking about someone who has, where the product is very important for them to get their job done, and they have strong influence and authority. And the difference between there's a couple of differences between champion and buyer. The first one is that a champion has authority to change business processes. This is really important and often overlooked when people call someone a champion. If your champion can't help get the product adopted by the company, then I don't think you can call them a champion, because they don't actually have the authority to make sure that the product is implemented technically, nor is it embedded into existing company workflows. So it's really important to find at least one person, and probably more, who has the ability to change the way that things are done so that your product can be included in the process.
I would go beyond probably, and I would say that's
Must have.
a must have, is to have more than one champion.
Yeah,
Whereas the
we're actually,
buyer may be just like the CFO who signs the check, right?
exactly. That's exactly it. So let's use that as a segue to the buyer. For the buyer, that's someone who doesn't require any additional approvals to make a purchasing decision. And in many cases, the product isn't very important for them to get their job done. So it could be a CFO or a COO, or sometimes it could be the CEO. Um, but the buyer is important because they're, of course, the only ones that can make the final decision on the buying process, and they're going to rely on the opinions of the champion in order to make that buying decision.
Right. They're just a gate. They're just a
That's right.
gate in
They're
the
the gateway.
process. Yeah.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. So I'll make one other point about the buyer, which is that the buyer typically does not have authority over business processes. They rely on the champion to make the actual underlying changes to the way their department or work group is run. So they will influence those workflows by having, OKRs or company goals, but they're not actually going to go in and make changes to the way that the business or the work group is run.
Yeah, that makes sense. The champion is the one that's going to be at the top of that communications pyramid when you're driving, you're executing on a change management strategy around trying to get people to adopt this new way of doing things. And the buyer might be a mouthpiece that says, yeah, I support this. But the
Right.
champion's going to be the one who's communicating that and architecting, or being part of the team that's responsible for architecting how we're going to drive this change throughout the organization.
That's right. And I think one of the pitfalls when someone calls someone a champion is they sometimes confuse advocacy for champion. And advocacy is just how vocal someone is about advocating for your product. But without the authority, the advocacy actually doesn't carry that much weight in most cases. For example, you could have a buyer who's a really strong advocate of the product. And by the way, I had this example several times at user testing. But because the champion below them didn't buy into it, we were never able to get the product adopted because the champion wasn't willing to change existing business processes, even
Yeah.
though the buyer was totally on board with what we were selling.
Yeah. Got it. Okay. This is great. See, I like, so all makes sense. I love how easily you've laid this out.
And there are a couple other things that we did not include in this graph for example, budget. Um, Only the buyer has budget, so it's not useful in determining what the difference is between power user and champion. And the other thing that we did not include in the piece is volume of usage. So I'm just referring back to the blog post here.
Yeah.
Because the reality is you could have a user who uses the product all the time, but has no influence in the buying decision. You could have a buyer that uses the product all the time, but again, you need the champion on board to change the business processes. So the volume of usage is not actually an indicator. It is not a good way to differentiate one user type from another.
Now, got it. Now, what happens though? What happens? I'm going to throw you a curveball here. What happens when you don't have a power user under your definition? So somebody who maybe the product is a nice to have, but they don't need the product in
Yeah.
order to accomplish their job.
Well, this is a classic go-to-market problem, especially in B2B. And I mean, unfortunately, what it means is you haven't sold to the right customer. Because the right customer, if you've narrowed your target market correctly, you will find the person in the business who needs the product to get their job done. So it's a poor go-to-market strategy. It's an indicator of poor go-to-market strategy if there's no one in the company who feels like they need the product.
Right.
And again, that's a valuable piece of information. The marketing team, the sales team, the product team, they all need to know that information.
Yeah. Or you just need to find that champion.
Right.
And have them figure it out.
Right. Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Bob in the corner doesn't need the product. You know, who does need it?
Right. Okay. Makes sense.
So that's kind of step number one. It's like, just make sure that you're really clear on the roles. And I'm not saying this is the only way to talk about champions versus power users, but it's a way to think about it. And you could incorporate something like this into your own framework for defining the roles.
Yeah.
So now the roles are established. Now you have to talk about what is it, how do you know when someone's a champion? Like, what does that look like? Like, you can't just say qualitatively it feels good that they're a champion. So what we're going to do next is look at, I'm going to change my screen here, and Jay and Jeff at Gain Grow Retain.
Yes. Good friends of ours and partners of ours, by the way.
And also great human beings.
Yes, very much so.
So they have put out a scorecard on a scale of 1 to 5 of how you might define whether or not how strong the relationship is with that champion or that power user or that buyer. So I won't read through everything on screen, but on the left side on this, number 1 is that there's no relationship, which means that there's no communications with me yet. Take that all the way to the other end, which is a 5, which means trusted advisor. And a 5 means that you're in contact with them routinely and they seek insights from you about help. So you are acting as a trusted advisor. They share insights and information with me as a CSM freely. So I'm able to get kind of rich organizational insights that maybe they wouldn't share otherwise. So another part of building building your relationship coverage model is to have very clear definitions for your team of what does it look like to be a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 as a power user, a champion, and as a buyer.
Yeah, you got to know where you stand with your customers in order to figure out, okay, how do I take this to the next level? And I 100% agree. I'm familiar with the relationship quality scorecard by those guys, and it's I like the simplicity of it, and it nails it.
I've seen it rolled out a couple of different ways too. So this is one of several models that I've seen. I like you said, Andrew. It's simple and easy to understand, which is one of the reasons that I like. Of all the models I've seen, this is the one that I like the most. So once we have a scorecard in place, then we have to think about how, as a CSM, where do I engage with the customer to develop, to go from a 1 to a 5? And so Ziv Peled at Apps Flyer, who we also were a big fan of his.
Yes, likewise. I like
really, really deep thinking around relationships, contact strategy, and so he has put together a graph that I'm showing on screen, and again, for people who are listening in, it's a graph that shows the customer journey over time, of course, starting, pre-sale, moving through onboarding, adoption, expansion, and renewal, and then also what each of those touch points are with the customer and how much engagement you expect from both the CSM and from the customer at each of those touch points. So for example, you're going to start with a demo, obviously, and then the deal is going to close, and then you're going to do some training and onboarding all the way through to the renewal. And the reason why I think this slide is important for the CSM is it helps them think holistically about what the entire customer journey is and where there are obvious points for them to come in and engage. So you can say, okay, CSM, I expect you to have, maybe some interaction with the customer at the demo, but on the onboarding, this is really your time to do a lot of engagement with the customer and maybe less engagement at future touch points, but you're going to come back in really hard later for the renewal. So just making it clear to your team when and where you expect and how you expect the CSM to engage with clients to drive that relationship score from a 1 to a 5.
And this is the first time I've seen this graphic representation of this. What I also really like about this, as a side note, is it really spells out for the CSM that there are going to be periods where the customer's not going to be engaging with you, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're disengaged. Which is something that we teach in our courses, in our level 1 course. Just because a customer feels like they're disengaged doesn't necessarily mean they're disengaged. You can actually do a lot more damage to your relationship by getting wrapped around the axle. So I love how this visually represents, hey, there are going to be periods of engagement and disengagement, and you need to be aware of that, CSMs.
That is such a great point. I guess I didn't read it that way, but it's really true. It kind of shows that in between touch points, you need to expect that the customer will engage a lot less strongly with you. And it is a normal part of the journey.
Yeah, that's okay.
That's okay, right? It's expected.
Yeah, exactly.
So now we've done step number 1, which is define what the roles are. Step number 2, which is to track the strength of the relationship across their journey with the company. And now we're going to jump to step number 3, which is possibly the most complex part, which is the relationship coverage model. So I'm going to jump to another screen here, which shows it's actually we spend a lot of time trying to make this simple. It's actually quite complex, but let me walk through.
I really like this. This is what really got me. I really like the 9-box framework anyways, but I really like the way you guys laid this out.
Yeah, so it's what we're looking at on screen is a 9-box grid with 2 axes. One axis is the breadth that your product attempts to target. So what I mean by that is your product attempting to solve a problem for a single work group within a company? Like for example, at user testing, we are targeting oftentimes the UX research group within the enterprise. Or are you trying to solve an entire departmental workflow problem? So this could be, the examples I give here are like Jira or Marketo. So Marketo drives all of the underlying data for marketing teams, and Jira drives all of the ticketing issues for product management teams. And then or is your company trying to target company-wide, adoption? So this could be like Gmail or Zoom or Slack. So you're attempting to acquire most, if not all, of the users of the company. And by the way, I think that's one of the most important differentiators in almost any model when you're thinking about relationship coverage, because the amount of users that you will have access to. You asked this question earlier, David, about what happens if you don't have a power user. The amount of users you will have access to dramatically changes, and the kind of coverage that you need to have in place also dramatically changes depending on how broad you want your product to be, how broadly you want it to be adopted across the org. That's one axis. The second axis is what segment are you selling into? So SMB, mid-market, or enterprise. I think we all understand those.
Yeah,
those segments.
That's pretty self-explanatory.
So if we take let's maybe look at a couple of extremes here. So if you're selling a work group product, so you're selling into maybe a subgroup within a department, into the SMB, first of all, you're not going to have access to very many power users or champions because the department you're selling into is quite small. So you might only expect to have maybe the maximum number of power users you can get is 1 or 2, and that's all you're going to get at that particular business unit. Same thing for champions. You might only have 1 champion, which is the leader of that, the manager or the director of that work group, which is why it's so important if you're selling an SMB product into a work group, it's so important to have a very, very strong advocate. A very strong buyer who's an advocate for the product. And the reason for that is because you don't have a lot of power users and because you don't have a lot of champions, if any of them leaves, the entire account is put at risk.
Right.
So you need some air cover at the executive level, at the buyer level, so that if a champion leaves, they're going to replace that champion with someone who's likely to adopt the product into their own workflows. So I just took one extreme there.
Yeah. Very much an extreme, but yeah, I could just see some CEO is having a conversation with one of his peers or her peers, and oh, I like this app. Okay, goes back to the office and says we got to get this app, and you do a deal, but if there's no champion or there's few champions or power users, you got an uphill battle. You can't assume it's going to be a renewal just because the CEO brought you in.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. Now, let's take something that's a little bit more kind of down the fairway. So let's just say we're selling Jira, so it's a departmental product, into the enterprise. Well, in that case, we actually expect to have quite a few power users because, again, we're trying to drive the workflows of the entire department. So we expect to have lots of power users. And actually, that if we're getting a whole department, we're going to get several directors or maybe even VPs also on board because, again, we're trying to get the product adopted across the whole org. And the nice thing is with so many power users and several champions, the role of the buyer is diminished. You don't care as much about whether or not the buyer has bought in because you have so much advocacy for the product at the champion and the power user level. So what we say is the buyer just needs to sign the check.
Right.
There doesn't need to be just sign the check and get it done with.
Get out of the way. Sign the check. Get out of the way. Let's do this.
That's right. So that's kind of down the fairway. And then maybe let's take another example here, which is maybe more of an extreme here, but let's just say you're selling Zoom, which is a company-wide product, into the SMB. Well, for a product like that, you expect to have many power users. Of course, if for all of us that work in our businesses, we probably are using Zoom every day for these types of meetings. There probably won't be very many champions on the product because they're not at an SMB. You don't need a lot of champions because a lot of times a CEO or a COO is making large software decisions. So it is important, though, that the buyer of the product is someone it doesn't have to be the CEO, but you want someone with power. So someone who has probably a C-level title, who can force the company to adopt the product universally into existing workflows. So they don't necessarily have to be a strong advocate for the product, but they need to at least be someone who will advocate for the product to be adopted company-wide. So unfortunately, for people who can't see this chart visually, there's quite a bit more information that we can go into. But the model, again, to summarize the model, it's, are you trying to sell to a work group, a department, or company-wide? And are you trying to sell into SMB, mid-market, or enterprise? And from that, you can figure out what your relationship coverage model should look like. And again, this actually isn't our opinion. We've spoken to dozens of leaders about how they think about champions, and this very much aligns with how many existing companies have formulated their champion coverage strategy.
Yeah, that makes sense. And by the way, we'll make sure to include a link to your blog post when we publish this. So anybody who is listening will be able to see these frameworks and these graphs on your website. All right.
Perfect.
No, but I like this. I like the way you've laid it out. I like the framework. It makes a lot of sense. Now, once again, for me, like yourself, we come from this world. It's second nature to us. I think that it's important that people who don't have the background that we have really understand this. Spend the time to. If you are a CSM, you really need to understand, embrace this type of this overview and this framework in order to effectively manage uh, those customer relationships, because it's not just spray and pray, right? That is a recipe for disaster. Regardless of how you decide to implement it, you need to have some sort of strategy, some sort of processes you want to follow that you can execute against.
Yeah, and I like what you just said, which is, you were speaking to a CSM audience. It's really important as a CSMs used to ask me all the time, hey, Chris, how do I level up my career? How do I work myself from a CSM to a manager to a director, et cetera? And it's important to do what Andrew just said, which is understand. I think it's important to understand the thinking and the framework and the strategy for building not just relationship coverage strategy, but just general CS strategy, not the tactics, but it's the thinking and the frameworks and how the sausage is made. That's an important part of leveling up yourself and your career. So I just want to plus one what you just said about, the deep understanding of the model.
Yeah, that's what we base all of our training programs on is now we're not going to tell you how to do this, step by step. We're going to help you understand why it's important, right? Why you need to, and you got to come up with it. You got to come up with your own approach. But yeah, this is great stuff. Uh, Wonderful. Anything else on this
I,
content, Chris? On this
I think
framework?
I think we've covered
Before,
all the important points. So yeah, that was the main thing I wanted to share today.
excellent, Chris. Once again, thank you so much for spending time with me today. Great framework, great approach. Love the content. Love the thoughts on this, and on figuring out how to manage those relationships with your customers. Such an important piece of the puzzle for customer success. And once again, I'm really excited for what you guys are doing with nuffsaid. As I mentioned before, if there's anything that we can do to help in any way, please let us know.
I extend the same. Pleasure is mine to join. Thanks for letting us participate, and looking forward to our future partnership together.